Let me tell you something uncomfortable. Most people don't actually want to understand things. They want to feel like they understand things. They memorize words. They repeat explanations. They nod confidently. And yet, if you remove the labels, the formulas, the fancy language, nothing is left. Real understanding is much rarer and much simpler. There is one question that separates real thinkers from parrots. One question that cuts through confusion like a knife. It's not complicated. It's not impressive. It won't make you sound smart at a dinner party. The question is this: do I really understand this, or am I just repeating sounds? That's it. Ask that question honestly, and everything changes, because the moment you ask it, excuses disappear. You can't hide behind jargon anymore. You can't blame bad teachers, bad books, or bad luck. If you really understand something, you should be able to explain it in plain language, without symbols, without buzzwords, without authority. If you can't, then something is missing, and that's not a failure. That's information. Here's the trick. Most people miss. Not knowing is not the enemy. Pretending to know is when you admit, I don't understand. Yet your brain wakes up. It starts asking better questions. It starts playing. It starts experimenting. That's how progress actually happens. Understanding doesn't come from memorizing answers. It comes from chasing confusion until it gives up. So every day, just once, take something you think you know, anything, an idea, a belief, a concept, and ask yourself, can I explain this simply? Can I explain it without the labels? Can I explain it to someone who knows nothing? If yes, great. You've earned that knowledge. If no, good. Now you're learning for real. That one question asked daily does something powerful. It turns ignorance into curiosity, confusion into clarity, and learning into understanding. That's not how you look smart. That's how you become smart. Most people believe that knowing something means being able to repeat it. They can quote definitions, recite formulas, or use the correct technical words, and that feels like understanding. But it isn't. Repetition is easy. It requires memory, not clarity. A person can memorize a sentence without having the slightest idea what it actually means. Real understanding is something very different. It lives underneath the words, not inside them. Think about how often people hide behind language. They use complicated terms because the terms sound impressive. The words create a fog, and inside that fog, confusion feels like knowledge. As long as the vocabulary is correct, no one asks uncomfortable questions. No one says, wait, what does that actually mean? But if you remove the labels and the fancy phrases, true understanding has nowhere to hide. Either the idea stands on its own, or it collapses. The danger is that repetition feels safe. When you repeat what you've heard, you feel certain. You feel protected. You can say, this is what the book says, or this is what the expert said. Understanding, on the other hand, feels risky. When you try to explain something in your own words, gaps appear. You notice the parts you don't fully grasp. Your confidence drops. That discomfort is exactly why most people avoid real understanding. They prefer the comfort of sounding right to the challenge of being clear. But clarity has a strange power. When you truly understand something, you can explain it without relying on the original language. You can change the words, change the examples, change the perspective, and the idea still survives. It becomes flexible. You can test it, question it, and even break it apart because it belongs to you now. Repeated knowledge belongs to someone else. Understood knowledge becomes yours. This difference matters more than people realize. Repetition creates followers. Understanding creates thinkers. A follower knows what to say. A thinker knows why it's said. A follower can answer familiar questions. A thinker can handle new ones. When something unexpected happens, repeated knowledge freezes. Understanding adapts. Another problem with repetition is that it hides ignorance. When people repeat, they rarely notice what they don't know. The words fill the space where curiosity should be. But when you try to explain something simply, ignorance becomes visible. You hear yourself say, well, it kind of works like, and then you stop. That pause is valuable. That pause is the moment learning actually begins. Real understanding also changes how you listen. Instead of collecting phrases, you start searching for meaning. You stop asking, what should I remember? And start asking, what is really going on here? You stop chasing certainty and start chasing truth. That shift is subtle, but it transforms everything. The irony is that simplicity is not the result of shallow thinking. It's the result of deep thinking. Anyone can make an idea sound complicated. It takes effort, honesty, and patience to make it simple. Simplicity means you've stripped away everything that doesn't matter and kept what does. Repetition adds layers. Understanding removes them. When you understand something, you don't feel the need to prove it. You don't rely on authority or titles. You don't panic when someone questions you. You're comfortable saying, let's look at this again, because your confidence comes from clarity, not from memorized certainty. In the end, the difference between repeating and understanding is the difference between noise and meaning. Noise can be loud and convincing. Meaning is quiet, but it lasts. And once you experience that difference, you start to notice it everywhere, in conversations, in books, in yourself. That awareness alone pushes you closer to real thinking and farther away from empty repetition. There is a simple question that, when asked honestly, changes the way the mind works. It doesn't sound powerful. It doesn't feel dramatic. In fact, it can feel uncomfortable, even threatening. The question is not about how much you know, but about whether what you know is real. When you pause and ask yourself if you truly understand something, or if you are merely repeating familiar words, you force your mind out of autopilot. Most learning never reaches this point. It stays shallow because the question is never asked. Daily life trains us to avoid this kind of honesty. We are rewarded for quick answers, confident tones, and smooth explanations. Schools test memory. Conversations reward certainty. Admitting confusion feels like weakness. So the mind learns a habit, collect phrases, not insight. As long as the answer sounds correct, no one digs deeper. Over time, this creates a dangerous illusion. You feel informed, but you are not grounded. You feel knowledgeable, but your understanding is fragile. When you ask this question seriously, something interesting happens. The mind slows down. You stop rushing toward an answer and start examining the structure of the idea itself. You notice where your understanding is solid and where it turns vague. You realize that some things you believed you knew are actually borrowed explanations held together by trust rather than comprehension. That realization can be uncomfortable, but it is also freeing. Now you know where to work. The power of this question is not in judging yourself, but in revealing reality. It is not saying you are ignorant. It is asking what is missing. There is a huge difference. Judgment shuts down curiosity. Honest questioning opens it. When you identify a gap in understanding, your brain naturally wants to fill it. Confusion becomes a signal, not a failure. Each gap becomes an invitation to explore further. Asking this question daily changes the relationship you have with knowledge. Learning stops being about accumulation and starts being about clarity. Instead of collecting more information, you begin refining what you already have. You revisit ideas you thought were settled and discover layers you never noticed before. Familiar concepts become fresh again because now you are looking at them directly, not through memorized language. This habit also builds intellectual courage. When you are comfortable asking yourself whether you truly understand something, you become comfortable saying, I don't know out loud. That honesty makes conversations better, not worse. It invites real discussion instead of performances. It shifts focus from protecting your image to discovering truth. Ironically, people who admit uncertainty often end up being the ones who understand the most because they keep learning. Over time, the question sharpens thinking. You start to recognize empty explanations instantly. Long, impressive-sounding answers no longer impress you unless they actually explain something. You listen differently. You read differently. You notice when ideas are being dressed up instead of clarified. This doesn't make you cynical. It makes you precise. You become allergic to confusion disguised as knowledge. The daily nature of the question matters. Asked once, it helps. Asked every day, it rewires how you think. It becomes automatic. Whenever you learn something new, a quiet check happens in the background. Do I really get this? If the answer is no, you don't panic. You slow down. You simplify. You look for examples. You test the idea in your own words until it either makes sense or falls apart. This habit creates depth in a world obsessed with speed. While others rush forward stacking facts, you build a foundation. And a strong foundation changes everything. It allows you to connect ideas across fields, adapt knowledge to new situations, and explain complex things without effort. You don't rely on memorization because understanding rise the load. In the end, this one question does more than improve learning. It builds respect for truth. It reminds you that knowledge is not about sounding right, but about seeing clearly. Ask daily. It keeps the mind honest, curious, and alive. Simplicity is often misunderstood. People confuse it with being basic, shallow, or incomplete. In reality, simplicity is the final stage of understanding, not the first. When an idea is truly understood, it becomes easier to express, not harder. The mind no longer needs to hide behind layers of terminology or complex structures. What remains is the core of the idea, clean and clear. That clarity is not accidental. It is earned. Most confusion survives because it is protected by complicated language. Big words create a sense of authority. Long explanations create the illusion of depth. But complexity alone proves nothing. An explanation should reduce confusion, not multiply it. If the listener walks away more puzzled than before, then understanding was never transferred. True clarity leaves fewer questions, not more. The real test of understanding is whether an idea can survive translation. Can it be explained without the original words? Can it be explained to someone with no background in the subject? Can it be expressed using everyday experiences instead of technical symbols? If the answer is no, then the idea is not yet owned. It still depends on memorized structure rather than genuine insight. Simplicity forces honesty. When you try to explain something in plain language, there is nowhere to hide. You immediately feel where your understanding weakens. Sentences trail off. Explanations loop back on themselves. You catch yourself repeating phrases instead of explaining causes. That moment of struggle is not a sign of failure. It is the mind signaling exactly where deeper thinking is required. There is also courage involved in choosing simplicity. Simple explanations invite scrutiny. Anyone can question them. Anyone can challenge them. Complex explanations often protect themselves by being inaccessible. If people don't understand, they assume the problem is with them. Simplicity removes that shield. It says, here is the idea. Look at it directly. That vulnerability is what makes simplicity powerful. When you understand something deeply, you gain flexibility. You can approach the same idea from multiple angles. You can change examples based on who you're talking to. You can connect the idea to other concepts naturally, without forcing it. Complexity tends to be rigid. It breaks when conditions change. Simplicity adapts. Another important aspect of simplicity is that it reveals what matters. Complex explanations often include everything, including what is irrelevant. Simple explanations focus on the essential relationships. They show why something happens, not just what happens. They answer the question underneath the question. This focus is what makes simple explanations feel satisfying. They close loops in the mind. Simplicity also improves memory, but not through repetition. When something makes sense, it sticks. You don't need to force yourself to remember it. Understanding creates structure, and the brain remembers structure naturally. Memorized facts fade. Understood ideas remain accessible because they are connected to meaning. There is a temptation to believe that difficulty equals intelligence. This belief leads people to overcomplicate their thinking and their speech. But difficulty is often just unresolved confusion. Intelligence shows itself in the ability to remove unnecessary complexity, not add to it. The most powerful insights often appear obvious only after they are fully understood. Practicing simplicity changes how you learn. Instead of asking, how much information is there? You ask, what is the core idea? Instead of chasing completeness, you chase clarity. You become less impressed by volume and more impressed by precision. Over time, this shifts your standards. You no longer accept explanations that don't explain. In the end, simplicity is not about lowering the bar. It is about raising it. It demands that understanding be so solid that it can stand without decoration. When an idea can be explained simply, it has passed the most honest test there is. Many people believe that ignorance is something to hide. From an early age, we are taught that not knowing is embarrassing, that uncertainty is a flaw, and that admitting confusion makes us look weak. So we learn to cover it up. We guess. We repeat what others say. We nod along even when nothing makes sense. Over time, this habit becomes so natural that we stop noticing it. Ignorance doesn't disappear, it just goes underground. The real problem is not ignorance itself. Everyone starts ignorant. Every new idea, skill, or field begins with not knowing. The problem is pretending. When you pretend to know, learning stops. The mind relaxes, satisfied with the illusion of understanding. There is no tension, no curiosity, no reason to explore further. Pretending creates a false line where none exists. Admitting ignorance does the opposite. It creates movement. The moment you say, even silently, I don't understand this, the mind becomes alert. Questions arise naturally. Attention sharpens. Confusion turns into a puzzle instead of a threat. What felt like a weakness becomes a starting point. This shift is small but transformative. There is a strange relief in admitting ignorance. You are no longer responsible for defending an explanation you don't fully believe. You no longer need to protect your image. You are free to ask simple questions, the kind that often lead to the deepest insights. Simple questions cut through assumptions. They expose gaps that complex questions glide over. Pretending to know also distorts communication. Conversations become performances rather than exchanges. People speak to impress, not to understand. Everyone plays their role, and real learning rarely happens. When ignorance is allowed, conversations slow down. They become exploratory. Ideas are tested instead of declared. Meaning is built together instead of displayed. Ignorance, when acknowledged, sharpens thinking. It forces you to define terms, clarify assumptions, and examine cause and effect. You stop relying on authority and start relying on reasoning. You don't accept ideas just because they sound confident. You want to see how they work. This habit builds intellectual independence. There is also humility in this process, but not the kind that shrinks you. It is an active humility that keeps the mind open. You remain flexible. You are willing to revise your beliefs when better explanations appear. This flexibility is not indecision, it is strength. Rigid minds break under new information. Flexible minds grow. Another danger of pretending to know is that it multiplies errors. A small misunderstanding, if left unexamined, becomes the foundation for more misunderstandings. Over time, entire systems of belief can be built on shaky ground. Admitting ignorance early prevents this. It allows you to correct mistakes before they spread. Learning thrives on honest feedback. When you acknowledge what you don't know, you give yourself accurate feedback. You can focus your effort where it matters instead of wasting time reviewing what you already understand. Progress becomes faster and more meaningful. The fear of looking ignorant often comes from confusing knowledge with worth. But not knowing something says nothing about your intelligence or potential. It simply describes your current position. Positions can change. Pretending locks you in place. Honesty allows movement. In the end, ignorance is not the enemy of understanding. It is the doorway to it. The real enemy is the refusal to look at it. Once you stop pretending and start admitting what you don't know, learning becomes lighter, clearer, and more honest. That honesty is where real understanding begins. Memorization is often praised as the foundation of learning. But on its own, it is shallow. It collects facts without connecting them. It stores information without meaning. A memorized answer can be recalled perfectly and still be useless the moment conditions change. Curiosity, on the other hand, is alive. It moves, it adapts, it pushes the mind beyond what is already known. When learning is driven by memorization, the goal becomes completion. Finish the chapter, pass the test, get the correct answer. Once the answer is stored, attention moves on. There is no reason to return, question, or explore further. Nold, GE becomes static. It sits quietly until it is needed, and even then it often fails under pressure. Curiosity works differently. It doesn't ask, what do I need to remember? It asks, why does this work? And what happens if it changes? These questions create connections. They turn isolated facts into networks of meaning. When facts are connected, they are harder to forget and easier to use. Understanding grows not by stacking information, but by linking it. Memorization can survive without interest. Curiosity cannot. It requires engagement. It pulls attention inward instead of forcing it. When you are curious, learning feels lighter, even when the subject is difficult. Effort is still required, but it feels purposeful. You are not pushing information into your mind. You are drawing understanding out of it. Another limitation of memorization is that it discourages exploration. When answers are given too quickly, questions die. Curiosity thrives in uncertainty. It needs space to wander, to test ideas, to make mistakes. Memorization closes that space. It replaces exploration with authority. The answer is correct because it is written, not because it makes sense. Curiosity also makes learning resilient. When you understand why something works, you can rebuild the knowledge if you forget a detail. Memorization has no backup. If the fact is gone, everything collapses. Understanding allows reconstruction. You may forget the exact words, but the idea remains intact. There is also joy and curiosity that memorization rarely offers. The moment of insight, when confusion turns into clarity, is deeply satisfying. It creates motivation to continue learning. Memorization rarely creates that feeling. At best, it creates relief when a test is over. Curiosity creates momentum. In real life, problems are rarely presented the way they were memorized. They come mixed, incomplete, and unfamiliar. Memorized solutions fail when the pattern changes. Curious thinkers adapt. They recognize underlying principles and apply them creatively. This is why curiosity matters more than perfect recall. Curiosity also encourages humility. It keeps the mind open. Instead of defending what you already know, you remain willing to update it. Memorization tends to harden knowledge. Once something is memorized, it feels finished. Curiosity keeps ideas fluid and revisable. Over time, a curious approach transforms learning into a habit rather than a task. You don't wait for instructions to learn. You notice gaps and naturally want to fill them. Questions appear everywhere. The world becomes interesting instead of overwhelming. This doesn't mean memorization has no place. Facts are useful. Vocabulary matters. But memorization should serve curiosity, not replace it. Facts should be tools, not trophies. In the end, memorization fills the mind. Curiosity shapes it. One stores information, the other builds understanding. And when learning truly matters, understanding always wins. Growth rarely comes from dramatic moments. It comes from small, repeated actions that slowly change how the mind works. Asking one honest question each day seems insignificant, almost too simple to matter. But repetition gives it power. When a question becomes a daily habit, it stops being an action and starts becoming a lens through which everything is seen. Each day brings new information, ideas, opinions, explanations, and claims. Most of it passes through the mind without resistance. It is accepted, stored, or dismissed automatically. When you make a habit of questioning your own understanding, this automatic process slows down. You begin to notice what you actually grasp and what only feels familiar. That awareness alone creates growth because it replaces assumption with observation. Daily questioning builds consistency. Instead of relying on motivation or inspiration, you rely on routine. You don't wait for the perfect moment to think deeply. You create one. Even a few minutes of honest reflection compounds over time. What feels small today becomes significant months later. Understanding deepens not because you worked harder, but because you worked more honestly. This habit also trains patience. You stop expecting instant clarity. When something doesn't make sense, you don't rush past it. You let the confusion sit. You return to it later. You accept that understanding sometimes unfolds slowly. This patience reduces frustration and replaces it with curiosity. Learning becomes a process instead of a performance. Asking daily questions also strengthens self-trust. Instead of relying entirely on external authority, you learn to check ideas against your own reasoning. This doesn't mean rejecting experts. It means engaging with them actively. You listen more carefully. You compare explanations. You notice when something fits and when it doesn't. Over time, you become more confident in your ability to think, not because you know everything, but because you know how to examine what you don't. Small daily questioning also creates momentum. Each insight makes the next one easier. Concepts begin to connect. Patterns appear across different topics. What once felt isolated starts forming a coherent structure. This interconnected understanding is hard to achieve through intense bursts of learning alone. It requires time and repetition. There is also a quiet discipline in this habit. It asks you to be honest even when it is uncomfortable. Some days you will realize that you understand far less than you thought. That realization can sting, but each time you face it, you strengthen your ability to learn. Avoiding confusion keeps you stuck. Facing it moves you forward. Daily questioning changes how you experience progress. Instead of measuring growth by how much information you collect, you measure it by how clearly you can think. Progress becomes internal. You notice fewer moments of vague understanding and more moments of clarity. You feel less rushed and more grounded. Over time, this habit reshapes identity. You stop seeing yourself as someone who needs to have answers and start seeing yourself as someone who asks good questions. That shift removes pressure. It replaces fear of being wrong with excitement about discovering what's true. Learning becomes lighter even when the subject is complex. The most powerful effect of asking daily is consistency of awareness. You stay awake to your own thinking. You notice when you are drifting into assumption or imitation. That awareness prevents stagnation. It keeps the mind alive and flexible. In the end, growth doesn't require extraordinary effort. It requires ordinary honesty practiced daily. One question asked again and again quietly transforms confusion into clarity and effort into understanding